长期向好。
We're fully confident of China's long-term economic growth. The confidence is not from nowhere, as we're confident that as long as we continue to reform and open up, China's economy will not suffer a hard landing.
Premier Li Keqiang reassures global markets as China's annual legislative session comes to a close. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's National People's Congress ended its annual session with the adoption of a new 5-year economic plan, aiming for at least 6.5% annual growth through 2020. China is transitioning from an export-driven economy to one driven more by domestic consumption as it goes through a period of slower growth and market volatility. In a wide-ranging news conference on Wednesday, Premier Li Keqiang addressed not only the economy but China's relations with its neighbors and the United States. There's much to talk about. To help us, we've gathered a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us from London is Duncan Innes-Kerr. He's the Asia Regional Director for the Economist Intelligence Unit. With us here in Washington is the editor of the New Silk Road Monitor, Afshin Malawi. Pepe Escobar is an author and independent geopolitical analyst. He joins us from Paris, and with us from Beijing is CCTV news anchor Zhou Yue. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start in Beijing with Zhou Yue. Let's first look at the Chinese economy. We just heard there from Premier Li Keqiang saying that China would not suffer a hard landing, not heading for recession. He also talked about China's new economy and more market reforms. Take us through some of the details.
Yes, indeed. This is actually the start of China's 13th five-year plan. Obviously, Chinese economy has been slowing down roughly to 6 to 7%. But more important is that China is want to overhaul its economy to have a better quality of its economic growth. I think there is some kind of a gap of perception on how the Chinese economy has been doing and what the world thinks China has been doing. Yes, there were some volatility in the Chinese stock market last year, but you have to understand that Chinese stock market is pretty small compared with a lot of advanced economies. Only 10% of Chinese have invested in the capital market, and Chinese investors are still new to this market. And the stock market does not necessarily represent how the general economy has been performing. China's economy has been slowing down for a world which has seen 3 decades of double-digit growth. That may be something new and alarming, but this is actually what China has been planning to do, not just something China has to stomach. China needs a better quality of its structure, not just a fast growth as it used to see. So what about equality? Now consumption has picked up, service has outstripped manufacturing, and China is cutting taxes and government red tapes. So I think China is doing well and on the right track. On the other hand, 6% of growth is still the envy of the world, except probably for India, which is still a much larger economy. So when Chinese Premier Li said a scenario of China's economy losing speed and hit the ground is probably just a fantasy.
Afshin, the One Belt, One Road initiative was discussed in both sessions. That is China's signature regional development project. What did we hear in those sessions that tell us about where this project is going, what's already been accomplished?
Well, I think what we saw is just a reinforcement of the importance of this One Belt, One Road initiative. And let's step back for a moment and think about. I mean, this is a breathtakingly ambitious initiative. And when you think about it, I view it as there's kind of two new Silk Roads. There's the organic commercial New Silk Road that has been taking place over the past 15 years or so. And I just came back from Dubai, and then I went to and interviewed some of the Chinese businesses that were there. And one of the things that they were telling me is they've been doing this for about 10 or 15 years. And they saw Dubai as an important hub, and they set up shop, and they're trading with Africa, trading with the Middle East. And this big Chinese demand engine has been absolutely vital to commodities producers in Africa, commodities producers in Latin America, Middle Eastern oil producers, and European industrial machinery manufacturers. So that has already existed. Now you add to that a big government-led initiative that's going to invest in ports and rail and infrastructure. And if you look around the world, the most prosperous countries, cities, and regions are often those that are also the most well-connected by their infrastructure. So there is no doubt that this is an ambitious initiative, and I think it's one that the world should really welcome.
That's right. We just saw the first Chinese direct cargo train arrive in Tehran from a small commodities port in China.
Absolutely. And a place like Iran could really use more connectivity, particularly since they've been isolated from the global economy for so long.
Pepe, China is also promoting closer economic ties with ASEAN countries in Asia through the One Belt, One Road initiative. How do you see this relationship advance?
Oh yeah, this is absolutely essential because it will run in parallel with the Chinese proposal for a free trade agreement in Asia, which is not obviously the Trans-Pacific Partnership being applied by the Obama administration. It's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is as ambitious as TPP, in fact even more ambitious than TPP, and links China with all its commercial partners throughout Southeast Asia, and it happens to be their largest commercial trade partner. It's already China. So we're going to have short examples, for instance. In Indonesia, they were in competition with the Japanese to build the first high-speed rail between Jakarta and Bandung. It was a very complicated decision for the Indonesian government. And in the end, the Chinese won because of the quality of their proposal and because it was cheaper than the Japanese as well. In Thailand, across Indochina, let's put it this way, they're going to build a lot of high-speed rail as well. In Thailand, at the moment, it's a huge debate because it's getting enmeshed into Thai politics, which we all know it's a kind of black void, isn't it? So, but the connections are all there. With Myanmar, the same thing, building of ports. Cambodia, I was in Cambodia earlier this year. Cambodia economy is completely integrated with China. So one belt, one road. In fact, the maritime Silk Road going through Southeast Asia and parts of sub-branches of the new Silk Roads going to Southeast Asia, big win-win situation for Chinese companies, for the Chinese government, and in terms of trade and commerce, overstepping political problems between some Asian countries and China.
Duncan, financial reform was an important part of the Chinese 13th five-year plan. We know that the Chinese goal is to move the yuan towards becoming an international currency by 2020. What came out of these two sessions that was important in your view on financial reform?
Well, I think it's really a re-emphasis of the commitment to financial liberalization. One of China's targets, obviously, is to have market forces exerting more say over the allocation of resources in the economy, and part of that is this liberalization of interest rates, the opening of the capital account, and the gradual sort of liberalization of the exchange rate. And I think China's still committed very much to progress on all of those. Which in some ways is a reassuring thing, given that we have seen a little bit of concern in recent months over issues such as capital outflows. I think one of the things that we have clearly seen from officials is that even as there are concerns over how to manage those flows, and you may see a little bit of incremental movement backwards and forwards as they try and sort of tackle that difficult task, there is still this commitment to opening up there. And on the capital account side, I think that's very interesting. One of the things that came out of the announcements that the Premier was making, for example, was that the government is moving towards more fiscal stimulus. Now, China, of course, has very low levels of external debt at the moment. I think one of the things we may well see going forward is an effort to bring more foreign capital into the domestic capital markets, and that will be able to help in ways such as funding higher government deficits as the government attempts to prop up the economic growth rate in the coming years.
I want to move now on to foreign policy. Afshin, Premier Li Keqiang talked about foreign policy. Did you see any major changes in what he was saying at that news conference? I mean, we did learn earlier that China is going to be safeguarding its overseas interests. Anything on the relationship with Japan?
Well, I think that what I focused on was, this continued use of this term, major country relations, and Premier Li brought it up and others brought it up, and the Chinese leadership has been talking about this for a while, and I think
that's the relationship between China
and the United States. Exactly, yeah, and they really are cognizant of this idea. There's this international relations theory, as you know, that says that a rising power is always going to come into conflict with the existing superpower, and I'm of the view that there's nothing inevitable in international relations, and the fact that they are really thinking deeply about this idea of major country relations, I think is very important. And when you look at what they say, when they talk about win-win cooperation, avoiding conflict, and each side respecting their core interests. The problem, of course, Anand, is that where China defines its core interests sometimes intersect with where the United States define its core interests, and particularly the area of tension is the South China Sea. Officials here in Washington, at this very senior level, all say that managing the South China Sea, though it doesn't make a lot of headlines the way ISIS make headlines, is probably the most important U.S. foreign policy management goal that they have going forward.
Pepe, Premier Li also talked about China's relationship with its neighbors. Let's take a listen to what he said. Let's watch this.
It's up to the efforts of the countries in the region to maintain regional stability and harmony in the neighborhood. It is also natural that some differences may arise between neighbors. But we believe that as long as we all treat each other with sincerity and seek peaceful settlements to differences through diplomatic means, regional stability will be maintained.
Will that reassure China's neighbors?
So it's a very sound affirmation, isn't it? Because this is what China is being selling across ASEAN, in fact, and to individual ASEAN countries. The problems that we have in the South China Sea, we need an overall, everybody sitting at the same table and discussing with ASEAN as a whole. The Chinese know that this is impossible because the ASEAN members, Vietnam, Philippines, they are bickering among themselves because some of their problems, let's put it this way, in the South China Sea do not concern exclusively China. They have problems among themselves as well. So this evolving ASEAN position to the South China Sea has been a chimera for the past 3 or 4 years at least. The Chinese know it. They know there's dissension inside the bloc. They would like to negotiate with the bloc as a whole. They know at the same time it's impossible, and at the same time everybody's advancing facts on the ground. China much more than the other ASEAN countries at the moment. So there's no other solution, considering that these are China's top trade commercial partners.
Right, Zhou Yui, I just want to get back to something that Afshin raised a moment ago, and that is the rising international tensions in the region over these islands in the South China Sea. How is that resolved? I mean, is there a problem here with, as we hear from the United States, the definitions of what happens in the South China Sea? And China doesn't want its territorial integrity to be violated, and the United States says, well, there's a problem over where those borders are drawn.
Yes, there are actually a lot of divergences of interest in terms of Asia policies between China and the U.S. The U.S. has been pivoting to Asia and has been doing so for some years. Recently, Mr. Obama talked to the Atlantic magazine, He said the U.S. has been able to mobilize most of Asia to isolate China in ways that have surprised China. But really, China has been the biggest trading partner to almost all the ASEAN countries, and when China established an international infrastructure bank, Asian countries came to knock on the door in droves. When U.S. wants to isolate China by inviting ASEAN leaders to include a clause on its communique on South China Sea, simply Asian leaders turn away their heads. So I think you always have to remember, for Asian ASEAN countries, America may be a geopolitical concept, but China is a geographical reality. There is no way that most Asian countries will turn away from China and band with U.S. to fight China. There might be occasions that some countries might use the rivalry between big powers and play one against the other to gain some advantages. But at the end of the day, they know they have to live with a stronger China. That is a safer bet. I think China has been making smart calculations in this. On one hand, China has been trying to up the economic cooperation with Asian countries, which is essentially mutually beneficial. On the other hand, China has been cautiously gaining military and geopolitical strength because it still needs to defend its interests and claims in the South China Sea, which it obviously believes. But I don't think this is China becoming assertive or aggressive, as many say. It may look like that, but China has always been maintaining those claims for centuries. It is just China was too weak to really back them up with strength. And now with this newfound power, China simply has a better chance to do that. I think the U.S. also understands that. It just simply wants to stall the process and upset the momentum.
Duncan, Chinese officials are saying, and I'm quoting here, positive momentum in the China-Europe ties is not an expedient but an inevitable choice of both, and Europe has come to view China's development and rise in a more objective and sensible way. Now, you've written about how the United Kingdom, for instance, judged the international mood about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank better than the United States. Has Europe been more realistic, more practical here in its relationship with China, and has the United States allowed itself to let ideology, politics get in the way?
I don't really think it's an issue of politics. I think there is, the US always has a very sort of hard negotiating position, and I think in many ways it's very keen that Chinese firms don't get access to its markets before its firms get access to Chinese domestic markets in the same way. And in many ways, the US is arguing from a position of strength. It's a much larger economy than Europe as a whole, and it's also doing much better economically. So from that perspective, the US sort of has a relatively positive position to start from. But I do think in other respects, Europe's attitude is certainly much more positive. One shouldn't sugarcoat that relationship, obviously. There's big disagreements over issues such as steel exports from China, which the EU accuses China of dumping on its markets. But in general, certainly Europe is much more open to Chinese investment. And I think in many respects, that actually is a very beneficial relationship from both sides. Certainly in the UK's instance, Chinese capital is being very important in boosting infrastructure spending. And that relationship is going forwards at great speed. Other parts of Europe, it varies a little bit depending on country-to-country relationship. Germany, for example, relatively positive. In some Eastern European countries, perhaps a little less positive. But it's a learning experience on both sides, I think.
Okay, go ahead.
If I may, I'd just like to add that I think this was a missed opportunity in Washington. I mean, if there's ever a non-controversial topic where you can have win-win cooperation, it's infrastructure investment, right? And infrastructure investment that will help build growth, because I think, in our colleague in China referred to President Obama's interview with the Atlantic magazine, and when he was asked about the most pressing challenge, he talked about climate change. Maybe in the long run, but as the old adage goes, in the long run, we're all dead. But I think in the short and medium term, the most pressing challenge that we face is this global economic slowdown that is going to affect jobs, unemployment, underemployment. It's going to affect global migration patterns as well. And I think if the United States participated with China in infrastructure initiatives, One Belt, One Road initiatives, it's one way, it's not the only way, but it's one way to contribute to the economic growth that the entire world needs right now.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll take a look at international perceptions. Plus, we'll ask our panel for their biggest takeaways from the two sessions. More of our conversation right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to our Journalists Roundtable. Let's get straight to the panel. So you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that there is a big difference in the way China views itself and the way the West views China. Let's take, for instance, the National People's Congress, China's top legislature. Now, some Western media label it as a rubber stamp parliament. And as a Chinese journalist, how do you define it? How do you see its role?
Well, I think the West should stop looking at China through their own lenses. China's political institution has not been like the West. It is not like the West. It will probably never be like the West. But of course, China is learning and adapting. For example, the NPC, the National People's Congress, the top legislature in this country. It may look like a rubber stamp in the eyes of many Westerners, but it actually serves a purpose of representative democracy. These 2,000 NPC deputies, they are from wide spectrum of social strata. They are the best and the brightest the nation can offer. And they have the drive to advise and critique the government. But they just don't do it the way like Western party politics, which in the eyes of many Chinese are a zero-sum game. One party success likes in the demise of the other. Here they call it consensual politics. Everybody provide a bit of their ideas, and then the ruling party, in this case the Chinese Communist Party, form a prototype guideline for this nation, and then at an annual meeting, 2,000 people representing 1.3 billion people analyzed and expanded the guideline, and they vote. And the reason why it always passed is probably because all the opposing ideas, conflicting thoughts have been expressed and adopted in the drafting process. And people here tend to agree on something, if that is something smart and workable. So when the guidelines is decided on, it is a go. And the Chinese still think this is good governance, at least for now.
Duncan, is it important for the international community to better understand the things that Zhou Yue has just been talking about there, how the legislative system works and what it's about?
Well, I think there are certainly rooms for misunderstanding. I mean, when you see sort of the votes at the end, for example, they tend to be remarkably high, and that I think sort of leads to a lot of you know, this accusation that it's a rubber stamp body. I don't think the NPC has ever actually voted down a motion in its history. But of course, the reality is, as Zhou Yue points out, that actually a lot of the debate happens off the floor, and that by the time things actually come to a vote, indeed actually by the time that the NPC itself is held, most of the debate has already happened. One should not forget that, for example, in the formation of the 5-year plan, there is a very, very long process that happens at the provincial and the city level, with everyone feeding into this national plan over a space of months, if not even longer than that, into a year. So by the time you get to the NPC, you get an end result. But in order to understand what's happening at the NPC, you need to kind of take into account this whole process of what's happened beforehand. So the NPC serves as a focus for the outcome, but actually it's the process that's important.
Afshin, when you look at coverage of the two sessions here in the United States, of course the United States and China differ in many, many respects, differ in their political systems. Was coverage enough? Was it fair?
I think you know, you did see, you know, big pieces in the sort of the major print dailies. I think television media is totally consumed with, you know, the election season. Maybe if Donald Trump had gone to the National People's Congress, they would have covered it. But television media totally missed the story. But I think in the print dailies, you did see that kind of, you know, coverage of you know, what was going on there. But I think what we miss here in the U.S. in terms of the coverage is we miss, you know, how China links to the American economy and how China links to the global economy. Because if there's really 4 things that matter to the global economy. It's the U.S. economy, it's the Eurozone, it's oil prices, and China. And the great China demand engine has been feeding into a lot of these other things. It's been feeding into the Eurozone, feeding into emerging markets, feeding into oil prices for so many years. And I think that's the piece that we often miss in the coverage, is the importance of China to the global economy, the importance of China to exporters here in the U.S., and the importance of China to the Eurozone's recovery as well.
Pepe, what does China need to do to improve, to get us to better understand how it makes policy and how it functions?
It's a question of soft power, and everything gets lost in translation, linguistic and in cultural translation as well. As was previously explained very well, by the way, the decision-making process in China is way more sophisticated than any well-informed Western may get, unless he has lived in China or he's very closely connected with China. So what they will need is a sort of a soft power offensive. For instance, internally, They had that very, very funny video selling the 4 comprehensives. There was also an English version. The English version in the US, at least, in Europe, nobody even paid attention to it. In the US, it was derided as a cartoon. No, it was not a cartoon. It was a very clever instance of soft power trying to explain a very complicated process. So China should invest more in these, I would say, fast-track soft power operations, not only in the US, but across Europe as well. For instance, the coverage of the 2 sessions in continental Europe was negligible, and sometimes practically non-existent. They were consumed by the Eurozone crisis, by Syria, by the Trump against Hillary, you name it. So it's up to Chinese propaganda department to deal with the rest of the world, maybe, but that's what's going to happen. A soft power operation all over the world, selling how China thinks and how China decides.
Okay, I want to get to the final topic, and that is the biggest takeaway from these 2 sessions. I've only got 2 minutes, so you guys have 30 seconds each. Afshin, what's the biggest takeaway?
The biggest takeaway is they got through this, and they showed a sense of competence that we're in control of the economy again. Because I think the biggest storyline over the past year has been this fear that institutional investors have that China has lost the plot, that they no longer have that ability to handle their economy. And I think they walked away from this with moving one step forward in the terms of competence in handling their own economy.
Okay, Pepe?
The way I see it, I've been covering the New Silk Roads practically from the beginning. Everything leads towards the New Silk Roads. That's the Chinese major foreign policy initiative, which happens to be the #1 global vision project for the 21st century. And there is no plan B. There's nobody else is selling a vision for the future. The Europeans, the Americans, many developing nations, even the BRICS. The BRICS is an evolving mechanism.
Right.
China is selling to the rest of the world inclusion and Eurasia as an organic whole. When President Putin first talked about Lisbon to Vladivostok, now it's Duisburg and Rotterdam to Shanghai. So this is huge, and they need to try to sell this with a soft power offensive all over the world, because there's no competition.
Okay, Duncan, the biggest takeaway for you?
The biggest takeaway for me is, how do you rationalize the excess supply that they're talking about while you're simultaneously keeping fiscal policy and credit policy loose to hit that 6.5% growth target? Looks like a very difficult task to me.
So you get the final word. The biggest takeaway from these 2 sessions?
Well, here in China, politics is actually a 2-way traffic, top-down and bottom-up. Well, China's been doing well in top-down. Chinese leaders are usually much more experienced and tested than many Western counterparts when they came to the top positions. And the Chinese government is probably one of the most efficient in terms of execution of its policies from the top. But China needs to do better bottom-up. The annual sessions is actually the institution to solicit ideas and criticism from the bottom, from the grassroots. It is a time when the Chinese government have full exposure to the public, both in terms of policy and politics. Usually the government officials are not so comfortable talking to the peers, to the press. But during the annual 2 sessions, they are more than willing to talk, because they will be held accountable for the policies and talks they made. And the Premier himself demanded his ministers to do more communication to the public and the world.
Right.
And also more and more government agencies are putting their work online to be transparent. So all these, I think it is a learning curve. China wants to do more reform piecemeal, incrementally, but it shows the momentum from bottom up.
Okay.
This is my biggest takeaway.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's all we have time for. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.